Now, I've just found out about a band that was doing cinematic progressive rock, but in the 1960s. They had strings, synths, spoken word, all decades before anyone else. So how were the Moody Blues not the blueprint for Pink Floyd, for Radiohead, even for Hans Zimmer? I feel like I've uncovered rock's best-kept secret, despite being told about how good they are for years. I've never really bothered to look into it, and with that discovery, the question begins now to take root. Why do the Moody Blues sound like tomorrow, even when you listen to them today? Now that's a fair question, and not one built on nostalgia either. The Moody Blues are often left out of the upper echelons of rock conversations, those reserved for the likes of the Beatles, Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin, say. And yet they laid the groundwork for much of really what followed in progressive and alt rock. The trouble is, though, their innovations were subtle, buried in lush orchestrations and poetic introspection. They didn't shout, they composed. So who were the Moody Blues? Well, they were formed in Birmingham, in England in 1964, and they began like many bands of the time dabbling in R&B and beat pop. Their first UK hit, Go Now, this was a straightforward ballad with a blue-eyed soul slant, nothing that hinted at the orchestral experimentation that would follow. But this all changed in 1967 when Days of Future Past was released, and this was a concept album that attempted something both grand and also peculiar. It was a full rock record played alongside the London Festival Orchestra, complete with symphonic overtures, poetic narration, and tracks that faded in and out like film scenes. This was years before Pink Floyd's Atom Heart Mother or Genesis's The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and nearly 2 decades before artists like Hans Zimmer would thread electronics through sweeping orchestral frameworks. Now, the Moody Blues didn't just anticipate these movements. In many ways, they invented the playbook. Now, were they really that far ahead? Well, let's put it this way. Radiohead didn't start adding ambient textures and avant-garde flourishes until the late 90s. Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon came out in 1973. The Moody Blues, by contrast, were merging mellotron swells with orchestral arrangements, existential lyrics and cyclical album structures, really way back in 1967. And yet, they rarely get credit for it. Why is this? Well, the Moody Blues were always hard to place, too gentle for hard rock fans. They were too structured for the psych scene. They were too experimental for AM radio, but when heard in the right light, especially perhaps through a 21st century ear tuned to cinematic composition and emotional range, their recordings often sound less dated than their more famous contemporaries. This is something I'm quickly finding out about this band as I dig a little bit deeper. Rolling Stone famously snubbed them in their early years, calling Days of Future Past pretentious, would you believe? Yet critics like David Frick would later admit that the band's catalogue aged more gracefully than many of their peers. And in retrospect, their restraint really became the strength. Now, as I begin to tap into the band, let's look at 10 of the tracks that I think best represent the band so far. This is not a ranking, it's just an appreciation of what I have come to savour, looking at the band more closely. Now, I'm happy for you to leave your choices in the comments, where I may well make a future video based on these suggestions. That's how we roll on this channel, you know that. So starting off, perhaps obviously, we'll take Nights in White Satin from 1967.
Nights in white satin, never reaching the end.
Now, even now, this doesn't sound like a track from 1967. With its sweeping string arrangements, haunting mellotron, and Justin Hayward's yearning vocal, this song predicted the era of art rock. It's more film score than pop song, really. It's a meditation on love, loss, and time passing rather than a chorus-driven radio hit. The spoken word section towards the end was unheard of in mainstream rock, predating literally everything from progressive epics to cinematic trailers. The second track is Tuesday Afternoon, Forever Afternoon, and another standout from Days of Future Past. This track showed how classical elements could really mesh with pop structured without feeling bloated.
The trees are drawing me near. I've got to find out why.
Flute interlude, shimmy mellotron and pastoral lyrics laid groundwork for bands like Genesis and Camel. It also foreshadowed how bands would begin crafting albums as conceptual experiences rather than collections of singles. The third track is Ride My Seesaw from 1968, and this was their stab at a proper rock song. But even here there's complexity, the rapid-fire bass, philosophical lyrics. The past is gone, it went like dusk to dawn. And intercut spoken lines all suggesting the band thinking beyond the riff. It's quite a kinetic track, but filtered through their very special lens of reflection and restlessness. Track 4, Legend of a Mind from 1968. Now this is dedicated to Timothy Leary, and this track is psychedelic rock, but with structure. Ray Thomas's flute solo is hypnotic. And the circular rhythms create really quite a trance-like pull. It's perhaps the closest the band came to the acid-drenched explorations of the contemporaries. But they do it with polish and care. No freakouts, no fuzz walls, just layered hypnotic progression. Track 5, The Voyage from 1969. This is an instrumental interlude on The Threshold of a Dream. This track feels like a precursor to modern film scores. It really wouldn't be out of place in a sci-fi drama today. With its eerie tones and ambiguous resolution, it moved the Moody Blues firmly into the realm of atmospheric construction. A move Hans Zimmer would perfect decades later. Track 6, Gypsy, of a Strange and Distant Time from 1969, has this track blending melancholy with forward propulsion. Drumming is punchier here, and the production feels quite richer thanks to increased studio sophistication. The lyrics really feel almost prophetic, as if commenting on future alienation. Now, that sense of emotional displacement would become a staple in bands like Radiohead and Sia Ross. Track 7 is Question from 1970, and here the band truly pushed themselves. Tempo shifts abruptly between aggressive acoustic strumming and dreamy contemplation. This idea that a single song could contain different emotional and rhythmic zones would later be the hallmark of progressive rock. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door, Hayward sings. It's not just a lyric, it's a statement of post-60s disillusionment. Track 8 is Melancholy Man from 1970, and one of the most somber pieces built almost entirely around minor chords and church-like mellotron.
I'm a melancholy man. That's what I am.
And this feels closer to ambient music or even post-rock than anything from the era. The Moody Blues weren't afraid to slow everything down to a crawl and ask for patience from their listeners. That in itself was radical. Track 9, You and Me from 1972, but by now the band had matured.
There's a leafless tree in Asia. Under the sun there's a homeless man.
And this track pairs tight harmonies with orchestral flourishes, giving it a spacious feel without drifting into excess. It remains one of their tighter arrangements, foreshadowing the streamlined sounds that bands like Supertramp and later Alan Parsons would develop. Track 10 is The Story in New Eyes from 1971, and this is a near-perfect blend of pop sensibility and artistic curiosity. The guitar riff is pure rock, but the lyric asks deeper questions. It proved they could write short songs with long-lasting impact, a balance most progressive bands never quite achieved.
I've been thinking about our fortune, and I've decided that we're really not to blame for the love that's...
Honourable mentions? I've added a couple here for you. Watching and Waiting from 1969.
Watching and waiting.
This is a soft contemplative track that really practically hums with resignation. One of the most fragile pieces. Isn't Life Strange from 1972.
Isn't life strange? A turn of the page.
This one's expansive and emotional, with a cello arrangement that lends its weight, a masterclass really in restrained grandeur. So if we fast forward to today, and the connections begin to stand out. Hans Zimmer's compositions, with their emotive synths and swells, owe more to the Moody Blues than to classical composers, in my opinion. Radiohead's A Moon-Shaped Pool echoes this same kind of ambient melancholy. Bands like the Flaming Lips and Air really celebrated for their cinematic qualities, but work with sonic palettes the Moody Blues were playing with 5 decades ago. It's not that they were perfect. At times their lyrics veered into self-parody, especially when aiming for the cosmic. And the later albums really struggled to recapture that magic of their 60s and early 70s period. But their ambition was sincere, and their expectations and executions really often totally impeccable. So why do the Moody Blues still sound ahead of their time, and what have I learned so far from studying this band? But because they weren't trying to sound like anything else, they built their songs like films. Emotionally rich, dramatically scored, unapologetically expansive. They weren't afraid to slow down, to speak softly, or think loud. Now, in an era of cultural volume, they chose clarity, and perhaps that's why they remain one of rock's quietest revolutions. A band that didn't crash through the grates, but instead planted seeds. Seeds that would quietly grow into entire genres. Maybe it's time we finally heard them for what they were. Not leftovers from the psychedelic era, but pioneers who helped shape the music we take so seriously today. So if you just heard the Moody Blues for the first time, pretty much like I have, you're not late to the party. You're early. Now leave your thoughts in the comment sections. Check out the description of this video for more information on the band and the albums. And watch the video I shot on the track Forever Autumn by Justin Hayward next. I'll see you over there.